Hello, everybody. It's Gary Stuckey with Real Music. On today's episode, I tell you what, one of the most talented guys ever in the history of rock and roll. The talented Rod Argent. You know him from the Zombies and the band Argent. Tearing up that Hammond B3 and playing the keyboard and just so awesome. His songwriting's amazing and singing. And been doing this for over 60 years and still going strong. Got a brand new album out. We're going to talk about all that. So awesome. You know, just excited to see a guy with all that history just talking to you and seeing his eyes light up when he tells stories. And I love it. So here he is. Here's Rod Argent. Are you ready to roll?
Okay. Yeah.
All right. Well, tell me this now. You know, these days you're watching TV. You know, you watch something like Night of the Living Dead or The Walking Dead, and you see zombies. You know, but back in the day, I don't remember seeing a lot of zombie movies. How'd you come up with the name The Zombies?
Well, you're right in the sense that the first sort of modern-ish zombies film was in 1967, and that was Night of the Living Dead. And even though there had been in the very early cinema, there'd been a zombies film, and I never heard about that for years actually. But it was, it was one of the very old actors in it. But the first modern zombie film was in '67. Now, I vaguely knew what a zombie was, and we'd been trying to get a name for the band. It's always very, very difficult to get something that sounds unusual or ear-catching,
Right.
or had some, some slightly interesting, in a sense of you sort of pique your senses a little bit phrase. And we've been called the most awful names for about a month. We've been trying to name ourselves after we first got together, and we had names for about a week, like the Mustangs, and I think the Sundowners. We were looking at films like The Searchers was named after a John Wayne film. So I think there was another John Wayne film, or at least a cowboy film, called The Sundowners, and for a week we were the Sundowners, and then we realised that many other people would be called something similar, and it didn't feel like a good idea. And then one day, the only guy ever to leave the band was a guy who became a Canadian doctor, and he's had a surgery practice in Canada for many years. He's still practicing actually,
Awesome.
and he said, "What about the Zombies?" Now, I loved it immediately because I thought, first of all, the Beatles had just come out in the UK, and they came out in '62 in the UK and had their first real success. I know it was a couple of years later in the States, but in the UK it was '62, and they were pretty cataclysmic when they came out, same as they were in the States. And I thought, well, if you get a name that no one else is going to have, then people don't start. If you're lucky enough to get any success at all, then people will just relate the guys in the band to whatever the name is. So, in other words, when people think about the Beatles, they don't think of insects or a play on words, even beat. They just think of John, Paul, George, and Ringo. So, and I thought if we were lucky enough to get any attention, then that will be the same thing, and no one else is going to have that name. And I loved it because that Colin hated it, and he said, "I don't know what a zombie is," and I said, "Well, I know it's something to do with Haiti, and people being put to work after they died, and all that sort of thing. A little bit of black magic. So it felt a little bit exotic to me, but I didn't really know anything about them. But Colin had no idea what a zombie even was. And do you know what? I don't think any of us, well, certainly neither Colin or myself, have ever watched a zombie film all the way through ever. So we must be some of the only people on the planet, that applies to.
Well, somebody says there's a zombie apocalypse. You think they're talking about you and the guys. Hey, but that's
Yeah,
good.
and
That's
I thought, well, yeah. It's I hadn't realised that we'd made as many waves as that, but there you go.
that,
Accept it and
that's
enjoy it.
that's awesome stuff, man. Well, so you guys started what around what 61 was it?
It was 61 when we first got together, and we did what Dave Grohl so wonderfully said. He said, "I'm just going to say to guys, if you want to be in a band, just go into a garage and suck." And we certainly did when we started, but we used wherever we could get to rehearse, and we loved what we were doing, even though it was pretty poor at the beginning. But we very soon, that was in 61. By 62, I think, um, we were ready to accept our very first gigs. And I have to say that in the St. Albans area, we picked up a really big local following very quickly. And in fact, I remember the first gig that no, second gig I think that I ever remember doing came by virtue of Colin. Colin was a real sportsman when he was young, and he played a lot. He played a lot of rugby. He was a very fast sprinter. He was one of the top sort of 10 sprinters as a schoolboy in the country, I think, over 100 yards as it was at the time.
Wow.
But anyway, he was a member of this rugby club, and he said they're having a dance with the dance band. And he said, I've got us a spot for 20 minutes in the interval. So we all turned up. We put up our gear, the very primitive gear that we had. And I reckon there must have been about 15 people in the audience. That was all for the whole dance, or 15 or 20 people or something like that. And we went on at half time, went down really well, and they wanted us to come back and headline. And then about a month later, we came back, and probably 50 or 60 people turned up.
Wow.
So, and then within a year, they were building a marquee on the side of this rugby club for the regular gigs that we were playing there, and we were drawing 400 people. And this is very local. This is all St. Albans. And then we entered a beat competition called the Hearts Beat competition, and we actually won this. And the head of Decca happened to be in the audience, and he knocked on our door backstage and said, I'd love you to make a record for Decca. And I went away and composed a song for that, which was just the second song I'd ever written, called She's Not There. And it went to number one around the world. So it was a wonderful start for us.
You know, that is interesting, you say, because you say you hadn't really written anything. What inspired you to write, and what inspired you to write that song? What was that song all about?
Well, the thing was that I always say the same phrase, with the naivety and ignorance that you only get once in your life when you're starting out. I had no knowledge of any of the pitfalls or anything that could go wrong. You have all that naivety and energy, and you think, yeah. And I thought, yeah, I can write a song that's as good as the Beatles, and it'll come out, and Colin will sound great singing it. We put loads of harmony on it. It'll sound great recorded, and it'll be a hit all around the world. And it was. I mean, it was just ridiculous. And very soon after that, we found out the reality of things when things didn't work out like that, of course. But at the beginning, I was in love with rock and roll. I was in love with music generally, actually. I was in love with rock and roll from the age of 11, when my cousin Jim Rodford, who was later the bass player with the Kinks, on their biggest ever selling hits, and he was the guy that introduced me to rock and roll. He was 4 years older than me, and he played me Elvis when I was 11 years old. And he was already in a skiffle group at that time. But I just thought this guy was like a guy from another world. And I thought there's no way anybody in England could get anywhere close to what he's doing. But I've got to be part of this in some way or other as soon as I'm old enough.
Right.
And when I was 15, that's when I started the band by finding 2 or 3 people, who could play a little bit, and that's when the Zombies was formed. But when we got this opportunity of a single, we were going to do the George Gershwin song "Summertime," and we got involved before the session. This Chris Wyatt, the original bass player of the Zombies, had a family friend who was a professional musician, and he said, "I know this great guy who's a great musician, and he's had some success with record production." He said, "You should get the contract that Dick Rowe, the head of Decca, has given you, and this guy who was called Ken Jones will look over it for you." And so Ken duly did that, and he came back to us and he said, "Well, it's a pretty good contract, really." He said, "But there are 1 or 2 clauses I would change." He said, "I'd advise this and this and this." And we said, "Yeah, okay, great." And then another family friend of Chris's, who knew Ken, said, "You should get Ken to produce, you know." He said, "You could have not just a staff producer at Decca, you could get Ken to produce you." So Ken did. And he came round and he said to us, "You could always write something for the session." And I went away and did She's Not There. Chris went away and wrote You Make Me Feel Good, which became the B-side of She's Not There. And that was it. Now, I had about 2 weeks to write this song before we started rehearsing it for the session. And I remember picking up some recent, at the time for me, John Lee Hooker albums that I had at home. And I just thought, I've got to find a starting point, a trigger. So the first track on the John Lee Hooker album, which I really liked, the album, was called No One Told Me. And I played it. Now, I hasten to add that it had nothing to do with the song that I'd written. But it started off something like, "No one told me, it's just a feeling I had," or something like that. And I thought, well, I actually love the way those words trip off the tongue. Nothing to do with the melody or what the story of the song was about. Just no one told me. And I thought, I've got to find a starting point. And I started weaving a song around that. Now, I had 2 other ideas in my head at that time. The Beatles' first album over here, or first was a very, very early track that they did, was called Not a Second Time. And it had a traditional sort of Ringo broken rhythm in the verses. And I thought, I want you to play a broken rhythm in the verse. And the other thing was that I was, apart from being in love with the rawest rock and roll I could find, like Little Richard, Jerry Lee, all the great rock and rollers, and Elvis, of course, early Elvis, only the first 3 years, but that very early Elvis. I mean, that's the only thing I ever listen to now of Elvis is the first 3 or 4 years. But I thought I'd also discovered the Miles Davis band of around 1958, and his first album that I bought was called Milestones, and it had the track Milestones on it, which I loved. I can still sing you the solos, the Coltrane and Cannibal Adderley solos on that.
Wow.
And I loved it. And I didn't know at the time, because I'm basically a self-taught musician, but I didn't know that he was experimenting with modal scales and harmonies. But there was something about Milestones which really got inside me. And I remember years later having a chat with Pat Metheny when Pat Metheny was introduced to me, and I'd never heard of Pat. He'd only just started. And to the amazement of people around me, he knew who I was. He said, "Rod Argent." He said, "You wrote She's Not There, didn't you?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Oh man," he said, that was the song and the record that made me feel I could find a way ahead in what I wanted to do by making a fusion of jazz and rock music." And I was so knocked out because I'd just seen his concert and thought he was absolutely wonderful. And he said to me, he said, "All that modal stuff that you had at the beginning on the verse, and I said, well, thank you very much. But I went away and I thought, there's nothing modal about She's Not There. And I went home and then I suddenly realized that what I thought was just a simple chord change, I constructed a phrase over it, which was a modal phrase to tie it all together with the chords, with what I played on the piano. So if you hear the opening piano figures on electric piano figures on She's Not There, that is a mode. And I'd done it without knowing what I'd done. But I was, so while I thought I was just writing something that was just, I thought this was our version of being the Beatles. But in fact, when I look back on it many, many years later, I can see really how unusual the construction of that song and how what the Zombies were doing at that time. And it was all completely automatic and not deliberate. We weren't planning to do anything. We were just working off inspiration and off the way that we were excited about what we were doing and what we were writing. And we were having a ball. And that somehow transferred itself onto the record. And in a quite a magical way, it that first session was really a great session. And in fact, the very first song I ever wrote, we also recorded on that session. It's called It's All Right With Me. And when you look on Spotify, that's still one of the tracks of the Zombies that's well up there in what people tune into on Spotify, what they stream. And that's extraordinary, because that was all from that time. So that was the start of me getting into songwriting, and of Chris White also getting into songwriting.
And there was no like that back then. And I think you started something there. And I'm sure you've had a lot of people over the years that are well known that have said, you were a big influence on their playing. I'm listening to Greg Raleigh of Journey and Santana, and I'm thinking, yep, he listened to you. I don't know if he's ever came out and said that or what, but I do hear it, and I hear a lot of people, and I'm like, yep. And tell me this though, the Doors. Now I know the Doors were later. Did they ever come out and say that y'all influenced them? Because the sound is definitely there.
I think the keyboard player from the Doors did actually give me did make some sort of tributary remark to me or about me really a long time ago now, and said that it was an influence. And also I always remember being knocked out because one of my very favorite early hit records from the West Coast was the Byrds' 8 Miles High. And I think it was McGuinn that said it was the Zombies improvising on She's Not There that made me feel there was a way of including the stuff that I'd heard in jazz, like Coltrane and everything, and incorporating it into, for instance, 8 Miles High. And he said that song would not have been written without, if the Zombies hadn't done She's Not There. And he actually said something really nice about me, something about it was something like it was Rod's improvisation on She's Not There that made me feel that this was a way ahead of combining things, and that was the writing of 8 Miles High, and that was a record that I absolutely loved. So that felt really terrific to me. And you mentioned Santana, and I remember the very first time I heard their version of She's Not There, and it completely knocked me sideways. I thought it was great because I always felt there was like a hidden Latin feeling way underneath She's Not There. I mean, there was nothing obviously Latin on our record, but I always felt there was a real sort of undercurrent of the way I feel things. And I always feel things when I write melodically and in terms of phrasing, I always think in a sort of syncopated way, in a very pushed way. I'll push syllables of a phrase, make them before the beat, which is a very Latin thing to do. So in small ways like that, and they did just a wonderful job on that. I think it was actually Bill Graham from the Fillmore that persuaded Carlos to actually do She's Not There. He kept saying to him, "You should record She's Not There," you know, and he always said that how much he enjoyed our record, but he was trying for a couple of years, I think, to work out a way that he felt he could make it his own and do it, you know, in the Santana way rather than just copy the record and really put his stamp on it. And oh my God, did he do it? It was just beautiful. And I've always loved his playing and the playing of Santana. They were one of my very favorite bands when they first came out. So that was a huge thrill for me.
Yeah, I'm sure. You know, and I'm going back there watching the videos. You know, of course there were no videos back in the day. What they were live performances on TV and things like that. But you know, She's Not There, and there's a couple online, and you look like you're really getting into it. You know, I know you were probably having the time of your life. You know, how did you come up with that just solo and just that feel? I mean, that's so amazing. You don't just come up with that stuff. Nobody can just come up with that. How did you come up with that? It's just you start just jamming, and it's like, what is he doing? It's crazy good.
Are you talking about the actual record itself now?
Yes, yes.
Well, let me tell you that all my solos, when they're first put down, and that includes, you know, my later band Argent, when we did Hold Your Head Up, they're totally improvised. They're totally off the top of my head. And then later on, I often revisit the construction of the original improvised solo. And I always try and change things a bit, but you know, to keep them fresh and to take things in new directions, etc. But originally, they are all improvised. I have heard outtakes from the original She's Not There session and Time of the Season as well, and you can hear the solos and on all the early Zombies tracks. If you hear the alternative takes, the solos are totally different each time because they are just improvised. You know, and I did love jazz. I mean, you know, the improvisation I did was a very rock and roll sort of improvisation and jazz, but they had lots of sort of jazz elements in the sense that I wasn't trying to insert anything. It was just what I felt naturally, and I was just trying to amplify the excitement of the music. Basically, that was the only thing I ever did. I really came to grief sometimes because in the early days, there are very few visual clips of the Zombies in their very early days because we were very badly managed in those days and nothing was ever kept. But you'll always see on the clips that do exist that when it gets to the piano solo, the cameramen don't know what's going on. In their minds, rock and roll is guitars. So as soon as it gets to a piano solo, I start really giving it everything and the camera goes on the drums or it goes onto the rhythm guitar, you know. And no, they just didn't get it at all. And I had to live with that. But, you know, it's funny, really. But, you know, but they are, as I said, initially, those solos, even if I later revisit them, and I mean, when I play Hold Your Head Up now, I always try and construct a different solo, but I'll always start with the phrases from the original solo on the album version of it, and then start developing it from there. But I'll always start with the same phrases. But that was totally off the top of my head when Argent were originally playing, and I think that way you get a real fresh feeling. If you get something good, the freshness of it being genuinely immediately improvised actually kicks in with all the other musicians because they respond in a different way. They respond in a really fresh way because they're listening to that particular phrase or whatever for the first time, you know, and it's always been, I mean, with our present band, the present version of the Zombies, they're such great players and they're listeners. They all listen. So if in the middle of Time of the Season I go into some different areas, different phrases, they're there immediately. And that's so lovely. And that's, you know, that's what really turns me on still at this age to get out there and we all feel the same. Really, it energizes us, And when you're on stage, honestly, Gary, for that hour and 3/4 or 2 hours, whatever it is, when you're on stage, there's no difference as to when you were 18 years old. You have the same energy. It just feels the same. And I don't think there's another profession in the world that makes you feel like that.
I've been there, not in the same level, but yeah, you're right. There's no other feeling like that. But hey, in that video, in some of those clips, though, like you said, the cameraman, though, he didn't know where to go. There's one of you, and you kind of look up like, oh, he's getting me, and there's like this statue or something, and you're like, oh,
that's one of the few things that still exists. Yeah, I know.
And you're like, hey, I'm on TV. Hey, but that's cool. They had no clue who this guy was. This is a talent here, people. You got to film this guy.
But I was looking. You know what? The statue, the bust of the guy I was looking at was Beethoven, I think. I was just looking.
Well, there you go.
Beethoven. Yeah.
They thought Beethoven was playing. It was so good. And I noticed that Colin, though, coming out, he's got that Beatle-esque look, and I guess that was the style back in the day. And he looks so serious when he's singing that song. Did y'all try to be really professional looking when you're, doing a show or something back then? What was your mindset as far as presenting yourself on stage?
Well, I have to tell you about the very first time that I ever saw myself on film. And my image of myself, this was before we turned professional, but it was at a 21st birthday party of somebody that we'd been booked to play at. And we were playing away. And my image of myself in my head, because I'd never seen a picture of us playing, was of this really cool dude who was being really sophisticated and cool as I was playing. And when the camera went on me, when I was playing a solo in something or other, I could see this Muppet, going completely bananas, sort of, like this all over the place. And I thought, oh my God, who is that? And that was, so that destroyed my own image of myself completely for a while. And there was another very funny moment, again, in our very, very early days, one of our very first gigs. Before we went and played this semi-professional gig, I decided, or we decided between us, that a couple of the members in the band hardly moved, particularly Paul Atkinson, the guitar player. He looked very cool when he was playing, but he hardly moved. He just stood there. And we thought, we have to make more of a stage presentation of this. So we started working out these very old-fashioned moves, from like, I don't know, the Ventures or something, or something from 10 years before us, where people were half dancing, sort of doing these moves. And it took us so long to work anything out that in the end, when we got on stage, there was only one song that we worked out moves to. So we played half the show and everyone was standing there almost completely stationary, just standing there playing. And then suddenly we did a Johnny Kidd song called Shaking All Over. And then suddenly all hell broke loose in this choreographed routine that we'd done. So the guitars started twirling around and Colin would duck underneath these twirling guitars for this one song. And it was just complete, and people were just looking at us in complete amazement. And then we went to the next song and we were all standing there absolutely still again. It was so funny seeing that go on. But we got past those very early gigs.
Awesome, man! Wow. And during those times, though, and I was reading about George Harrison gave you a thumbs up on your song. What was it, on the Jukebox Jury show? Do you remember that, when George is saying, "Hey, he likes the song"?
Oh, wow. Honestly, in those days, I have to tell you, and it was probably the same in the very early days of the Beatles' success in the States, any word from a Beatle was like a word coming down from Mount Olympus. It really, it was the word from the gods. I mean, it really was. And I remember our manager saying, "Oh, your record's going to be on Jukebox Jury." Now, Jukebox Jury, you probably know, but for people that don't, they used to play about a minute and a half or 2 minutes of maybe 8 or 9 records, and then the panel would all decide whether it was a hit or a miss. And George Harrison was on, and then our manager phoned up and said, I think they're going to play your record on Jukebox Jury. It might not happen because they might not get to it, but it's on the cards that it'll happen. And we thought great, and then I heard that George Harrison was going to be on there, and I thought, oh my God. And when the program started, I thought, oh my God, George Harrison is on it. If they play our record, if he says something bad about it or doesn't like it, I don't know how I'm going to carry on. I mean, it's going to be, I won't be able to stand it, And then, anyway, George wasn't being horrible to anybody, but he was being very honest, like the Beatles always were, which was a real breath of fresh air in those days. And a record would come on, and he'd say, "Well, I don't know." He said, "That's not a hit." He said, "It sounds like so many other records, etc." And then the next record would come on, and he'd say, "Well, that this bit's okay, but it doesn't quite make it." And then they said, "Right, the next record is the Zombies with She's Not There." And I thought, "Oh my God!" And they played it, and they went to George, and George said, "Well done, Zombies." He said, "I really like that." He said, "That's a hit." He said, and he actually said something like, and I can't remember all the words. He said something like, "If that's their real pianist, he's really good." And I thought, shit, that's that. If nothing else happens to me in my life, this is this is it. I'm going to luxuriate in this, and it was the most wonderful thing. Honestly, it was just gorgeous to hear that, and it was like word from the gods, in those days. And I'm sure that made people go out and listen to it and buy it. I mean, because in those days you had to go into a record shop and they would play half the record for you, and you'd have headphones, and they play half the record so you can decide whether to buy it or not. Because in the UK there was no radio needle time at all, nothing. There was Jukebox Jury and maybe one other program where a DJ would play for half an hour, half of a few records, and that was it. And luckily, soon after She's Not There started to make an impression, the Pirates started. So broadcasting off the coast, and the whole of radio then, and that's why the BBC had to get on the bandwagon in the end. But in those very early days, you had very, very limited way of people hearing the record, and that really helped us, and then once it started to move, it got its own momentum, and became a big hit, which was absolutely gorgeous.
Awesome. And
can I just say one other thing?
Yeah,
that day in 1956, and I can still see myself in the room with Jim when he played me Hound Dog, and because first of all he played a Bill Haley record, which I sort of quite liked, but it didn't do an awful lot for me. And he said, "Well, just listen to this." So I've just bought this; it's just come in, and he played me Hound Dog, and my whole world changed, as it did with many people have said the same thing. I think probably Van Morrison and maybe the Stones and the Beatles said the same thing. I don't know, but it changed my whole world. And then when I saw him on this little clip on TV from America, I thought this man is from another world. There's no way I can ever, any of us can be anything to really do with that. But nevertheless, I have to try and dip my toe in the water, and I did form a band when I was 15, and that was when I met Paul Atkinson and then Colin and everybody. And then just 8 years later, when it went to #1 in Cashbox in the States and #3 in Billboard, or #2, it might have been 2 even, I can't remember. Many years later, I found out that Elvis had that record along with 2 other of our records on his jukebox, and that was just
Wow.
8 years after I'd heard this universe-changing experience, and there suddenly 8 years later, which these days the last 8 years have gone by in a flash, as you get older.
Right.
But
Right.
to think that Elvis actually had, I mean, I remember us all in '65 trooping along to Elvis's house, and we just opened his gate and walked up the drive. There was no security. Knocked on the
Wow.
door, and I think it was Vernon that came to the door and said Elvis was away filming. And he said, and I thought this was just Southern hospitality, and he said, but he really loves you guys, and he'd be real sorry to have missed you. So we thought, well, it's a lovely thing for him to say, but he doesn't know who we are. But that's okay. That's Southern hospitality. That's lovely. Then he said,
Right.
have a look around, and he invited us into the house, and we felt very embarrassed, and just stayed there for a few minutes, and then went out. And it was all those years later when an Irish DJ said to me, I was telling that story, and he said, I can't believe you didn't know that Elvis had 3 of your songs on his jukebox at that time.
Wow. Wow. That's crazy. But that shows you how good you are and how good he was. That's
Oh
amazing.
man. Well, he was a god as well for me, like with many other people,
Right. Sure was. Well, later, whenever y'all have been around a while, and now this is something I've been wanting to ask you now. The song "Time of the Season."
Yeah.
There's a phrase in there that says, "Who's your daddy?" Had that phrase ever been used? Did you coin that phrase?
I think I did, and I'm only saying that because many years later, a sports reporter from New York said to me, he said, I've tried to trace the origin of this phrase. He said, and it became used in black culture, first of all, but and used in sports very much, who's your daddy?
Right.
And he said, yours is the first use of that phrase that I can ever trace. So there's a good chance that we were the very first people ever to use that phrase. So, I think that's supposed to be true. Yeah.
Awesome. That's a great song. What's the story behind that song? I mean, what was the motivation for that song?
Well, I tell you, at the time we were recording Odyssey and Oracle, and the reason we produced it, Chris White and I, who were the two writers in the Zombies, we become very frustrated at the way our recent singles have been produced and recorded. We loved the very first session we did and everything that was on that, including She's Not There, You Make Me Feel Good, the song I mentioned before, It's All Right With Me. We thought they all sounded really exciting. And we did a version of Summertime, which we thought was great and has been used many times on sort of definitive biographies of George Gershwin, actually, apart from anything else. But the recent singles before Odyssey and Oracle had really frustrated and disappointed us because they just were not the way we'd heard the songs in our minds when we wrote them. So we said we have to, it was in the air that we might split up. So Chris and I said we have to, at least, we don't know if we can produce, but we have to try and produce an album ourselves to get our own ideas of how our songs, when we write them, should be transferred to record. And we had the great good fortune of being able to do it with Jeff Emerick, Peter Vince, and they were beautiful to work with, and said lovely things about us right through the years. I mean, I think in Jeff Emerick's autobiography, he quotes us as being one of the few original groups that he recorded outside of the Beatles, and says some lovely things about us. So that was lovely. But it was the time of it was the sort of great peace and love movement, and while we weren't in any way naive about this, and we could see the naivety of a lot of the things that were going on, it was still a very powerful movement, and it was in my opinion, it was a very powerful reaction to what was going on in Vietnam, and the fact that for the first time ever, footage was being broadcast, it wouldn't be as topical and realistic as footage that's used now on the news, but it was a huge revolution at the time, and the whole of the young generation around the world was seeing the reality of war in detail, in real terms, and it made them, of course, say, we don't want anything to do with this. And that's where the peace and love thing started. And it was very powerful, even with all the drawbacks and the naivety and the misuse of drugs, which caused huge problems as well. But in those early days, I couldn't help, along with everyone else, about being affected by I think they call it the zeitgeist, don't they? The feeling that's in the air about everything. And the fact that you could have these huge festivals where, certainly in the earliest days, there was no violence. It was just unbelievable to get that many people together without violence. I know things changed later, but that was the feeling in the early days. And it was very powerful. And I wanted to write a song that had something of those sort of feelings within it without being too literal at all. And I said to you that the first song we'd ever recorded was George Gershwin's Summertime. And I've always had a love of that song. I was just thinking, I had one more song to write for the album. And I came up very quickly with that particular song. And at the time, I shared a flat with Chris White. We had a room each in this flat, and there was a third person who had another room. So the three of us just in this flat. And I remember playing it to Chris and saying, I've got this very simple idea for a song. I think it could be a hit, And I was the only person in the world who thought that before we recorded it. But I really did. And it always had a very simple construction in my mind. And like so many of the tracks I did, I was always trying to insert a bit for me to play in it. So I had not one, but two solos written into it, in the middle and at the end. Jeff Emmerich recorded it. The whole thing was recorded in about, in fact, the backing track was recorded in about 2 hours
Wow.
in Abbey Road. Jeff got this beautiful bass and tom-tom coordination of the two sounds together. The boom, 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 that bit. And I didn't quite know. There was nothing unbelievably unusual in it, but it just sounded magical to me. And then I had the idea of the claps and the vocal percussion, which we just put on at the last half an hour of the session. And then we had a second session for it where Colin did the vocal and we did the harmonies. And that was the recording of that song. But when I was writing the lyrics to it, I had about when I'd started writing it, written very quickly, I'd been thinking of Summertime, and the feelings in it were a bit sort of peace and lovey, in the sense that lines like "What's your name? Who's your daddy? Is he rich like me?" That was really a feeling of is he rich in terms of, can he show you what you need to live? In other words, not financially rich, but is he rich in his mind and what he's able to pass on to you? It was those feelings, but I didn't want to spell anything out. It was just, that was the feeling that was in my mind when I was doing it. And I wanted to get some of the sort of atmosphere and feeling of the lyrics in Summertime. And there was one line in Summertime that's your dad is rich and your mama's good looking, so hush, little baby, don't you cry. And that started me thinking, when George had written, or when Ira Gershwin had written, your daddy's rich and your mother's good looking, he was talking about your daddy being rich with money. But I thought, what I'm thinking of is passing on the richness of how we should start living our lives now, and what we have to try and pass on to our kids. So it was the combination of all those things together, actually that brought the song together.
So, but at that time though, when the song really hit it big, the band had already broken up, right? How did that happen?
Well, the thing was, we recorded the album, and in the UK, for many reasons, one of the reasons being that we were so badly managed, as I've always mentioned in the very early days. You had our contemporary bands, you had bands like The who had great management, who understood the music they were making, understood the image they should be projecting. Epstein, of course, did a wonderful job on the Beatles. Andrew Loog Oldham knew exactly how to manipulate the image of the very early Stones. Excuse me. To put across how they should be presented, and our manager had absolutely no idea at all, and didn't get involved in that. And we had the most appalling photo sessions at the beginning of our career, etc., in the UK, and that stuck with us, particularly in the UK. In other parts of the world, people got access to different things, and also our early production. The right records weren't being put out. We didn't have any input or say into what records should go out as singles, or what the mix should be. We had no control over all that, and so we made this record. We were knocked out because we felt it was the best thing we could do at the time, and we honestly all felt that we made an album that we could be proud of. For the first time in ages, of all the tracks that we were pleased with. But no one in the UK really took any interest in it at all. There was one DJ who was actually a very famous DJ, later on became quite mythical, called Kenny Everett. He was the only DJ who loved it. He absolutely loved it. And I remember he had us on his program, and we had about like a 20-minute or 30-minute interview with him. And he played a couple of tracks from the album. And I remember Cat Stevens being on and hearing a Rose for Emily and saying, "Oh man, I love that song." And I remember being knocked out with that when we were getting these sort of reactions. But no one was interested. And we thought we'd put out one single, and we put out Care of Cell 44. And if it's a hit, we'll stay together. Because Chris and I had plenty of money, because we had very honest publishers, and they were paying the money that should come through to us, which was great, because that wasn't a common thing at the time. But from a performance point of view, which was where all the other guys got their money, we were being pretty much shafted. And so the other guys in the band didn't have any money, and they were saying, one of the guys was saying, I'm getting married and I've got no money. I'm going to have to move on. So we thought, okay, if this first single's not a hit, we'll break up. And we did, and we thought that was that. But we were pleased because the record was out there and we really liked it. And then Al Cooper came over to the UK, picked up 200 albums. He said out of those 200, there was only one that knocked his socks off, and that was obviously an Oracle. And he went back to Clive Davis at CBS and said, "You have to buy this from whoever's got it." And Clive said, "Well, we actually own the rights to it." He said, "But we didn't think it was commercial. We like the album, but we don't think it's commercial." And Al said, "You've got to put it out. You just got to put it out." And long story short, it was the third, I think, or third or fourth single that was released. Third single, I think, and the very last one that Clive was prepared to release. And it didn't have an awful lot of push behind it from CBS, but it caught fire. And once it had caught fire, it just went up again to number one in Cashbox, and in Billboard was 2 or 3, and became a number one hit in many places in the world, except for the UK. But the extraordinary thing is, in the UK, people in their 20s and everything, we play at festivals or wherever we're playing, and they know it, and it's they really know it, and they go crazy when they hear it. And it's never been a hit. It's been out 5 times in the UK. It's never been a hit, but it gets played by everybody as a golden oldie, and that's crazy in the UK because it was never a hit. But it's incredibly well known, and it's now been used in many films and syncs for adverts and stuff.
Sure.
So it's become very successful, and it's become a real staple. And in fact, when BMI used to have their awards, I mean, they've stopped doing it now, but the last one I had for it was sort of 7 million, I think, 7 million
Wow.
plays.
Wow.
And unbelievably, that's more plays than many of the Beatles records that you would think. I mean, not probably not Hey Jude or anything like that, but things like, I
Right.
don't know, 8 Days a Week, Hard Day's Night. Even I think it's more plays than. But I may be wrong on that. But things that you would think were, it was one of the top 30 English played records at that time. A few years ago, when they were still doing their awards, that had the most plays of any English records in the US. So it really made its mark, and that's a lovely thing. And when we find that these things, we always have a young component in our audience where we play. I'm not being ageist. I mean, I don't care who comes to see it. It's wonderful. And if people have been following us throughout our whole career, that's even more wonderful. But when you get sort of 20-year-olds as well coming along, and what you're doing when you were 18 or 20 yourself, when you find that it's relating to in a powerful way to people of this generation, that's such an unlooked for feeling. It's such a lovely feeling.
I bet it is. Awesome. Well, of course, the band broke up and you went on to your own band, Argent. Hold Your Head Up, which I love. It reminds me of Paul McCartney. Was that some kind of similarities there? But of course, you had fun in those days too. How was that different than what you had been doing with the Zombies with your own band, Argent?
Well, it was really just, it was more of the same for me, but in the sense that we were always trying to try out new things and push boundaries, as every band was doing at the time. I always think of the Beatles as being the first progressive band, because right from the beginning, they weren't happy to rest on their laurels and try and repeat what they've done. They were always trying to push boundaries and try different things. And and I was hungry to try many different things at that time. But the other thing is that you write for the people that you're playing with. So I was writing for the characteristics of Russ's voice, beautiful voice, but a very different voice to Collins, and to the other players in the band. And we were following where things were going. Again, I was always myself writing for myself spaces where I could have elongated improvisations. I mean, the funny thing is about Hold Your Head Up is that when that came out, singles were not fashionable at all. If you were a credible band, and I wrote Hold Your Head Up as being an album track, and we hadn't got the album finished in time for a tour, so the record company put out an EP, and we had the 6-minute 30 version of Hold Your Head Up, which was basically the body of the song was 3 minutes, and there was a 3-minute organ solo in it.
Awesome.
And when it first came out, there was one DJ here, again, quite a famous DJ called Alan Freeman, and he, in spite of it being 6 minutes 30 long, he would play. He had a record program once a week on the BBC, and he would play it every week. And unbelievably, the record kept tickling at the bottom of the charts. So we went away to Holland to do a tour, and while we were away, the record company made an edit by basically cutting out the whole organ solo, and then the thing went into the top 50, and then as soon as we appeared on Top of the Pops, it shot up to sort of the top 10, and then number 4 or something like that is where it finished up. And that was the story of that song. But do you know what? I had a wonderful moment about 2 years ago, or it might even have been 3, when at Christmas time I was at my brother-in-law's place, and he's Paul McCartney's recording engineer. And we had the radio on, and there was a program called Sounds of the 70s. It was Johnny Walker, and his guest was Rick Wakeman. And there was a spot on this show, and I've done it myself, where you choose a long version of a famous track, and a full-length version, and they play it. And they said to Rick, what are you going to choose? And he actually said this. It made my Christmas. It really made my Christmas. He said, I want to choose Hold Your Head Up by Argent. He said, the organ solo on that is the greatest organ solo ever played on the records.
Wow. Wow.
And I could have fallen over. Honestly, it absolutely made my Christmas. It really, really did. So that was lovely. And again, this is, years and years and years after the record came out. So you think, wow, other people are hearing that, and that's lovely.
Well, he's not wrong. I mean, that solo, man, is on fire. Well, I won't keep you in, but I do want to talk about your new album with the Zombies.
Yeah.
I know you were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame a few years ago. I know that was awesome after all these years.
It was. Yeah.
And I know you have great memories of that. But the new album, tell me about that, and how excited were you to record a new album, and what's the reaction been like?
The reaction has been superb. We've had, even in the UK, we've had absolutely wonderful reviews in all the quality papers, and it's made them also come to our UK concerts and give us out absolutely stunning reviews for our concerts as well. And always, what I just mentioned to you a little while ago, always mentioning the fact that they couldn't believe how young a proportion of the audience was. So it's been a really fabulous reaction. I told you that Odyssey and Oracle was the album that Chris and I produced ourselves. So there was no outside interference in any part of the construction of the album. And it's the same with this album, Different Game. And we recorded it. I've got a studio here. I've been in this particular house for 8 years now. And I had a lot of success as a producer with a guy called Peter Van Hook, who used to be Van Morrison's drummer, was in Mike and the Mechanics. And the two of us produced several albums that were multi-million sellers for other artists. And in my previous house, we recorded them in the little studio I had there. When I moved to this house, I thought, I've got to have a new studio. And Pete said to me, you've got to get this particular guy called John Flynn to design it acoustically, even though it's only a small building, Gary. It's only small, but it's big enough to have a live room and a control room and to keep all my vintage keyboards and everything in, and so that we can do everything live, which is the way I love to record now, actually, in the way that we always used to in the old days, because I think you capture something with a performance when you do that. So this was the first album. I co-produced it with a live sound man who's very talented, called Dale Hansen. And I wrote 9 of the 10 songs, but they all had the character when they were recorded that I had heard in my head when I'd written the songs. And for me, that's what it's all about. It's absolutely what it's all about. Capturing the spirit of what you feel in your mind. It's not to say that other people's visions of things are not good, but they're different to your own, and different to the way that you originally perceive them when you write. And I love that. And this is the first album since Odyssey and Oracle that we've had that chance to put out something which is constructions of songs that in the way that we hear them ourselves. We recorded it all live as live as we could, in the sense that in the old days there was no other way of doing it, and I've been involved in many sorts of different ways of recording since then. But on this particular one, we've been playing up to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. We've been playing intensively as it happened in the States. And I thought the band had never sounded as good. And as soon as we got back, we wanted to record a new album and record it live, as live as possible. So everyone bounced all the time, get Colin to sing a guide vocal so that we respond to how he's singing. He responds to how we're playing, and everyone listens to what everyone else is doing, and as you do on stage, and starts to make a whole out of reacting to people when they're playing live, which I think is part of what music's all about. And we did this, and in fact, in the end, because COVID had just started, we had to stop recording, particularly because our bass player, but it was with everybody really, but our bass player comes from Denmark, and everyone was isolated. And I did not want to do it in the way that so many people did during COVID, which is phoning to each other's studios and say, put your part on here. I wanted this to be a communal creative experience. And we waited really until we did 2 tracks right at the beginning, and then we waited until everybody could get together again. And even though, because of that, the album was recorded over a long period of time, the actual recording sessions were very much like the old days. When, I mean, for instance, we did a thing called Drop Ruling and Stupid. We've just had a documentary made that's been directed by Robert Schwartzman and executive produced by Tom Hanks, and that's going to be coming out later this year, I think. And there's a little part on it where, unbeknown to me, the bass player had just held up his iPhone while we were doing a take, and it was a take of something called Dropped, Reeling and Stupid. And you can tell, because each note is exactly the same, that this one take, with a couple of little touches afterwards, was the complete track that we got. You know, it was the master tape that we chose for the album, and it's pretty much complete as we played it, and it sounds great. And Colin's vocals great. You know, we just touched up a couple of things afterwards, added 1 or 2 harmonies afterwards to all the tracks. But that aside, we caught that creative experience of everyone, you know, locking in together and getting something that you hope that the experience of everybody playing together is somehow greater than the parts. So, you know, you hope all the parts are great, but then the final thing, for some reason, on a particular take that you choose, is, you know, you might have done 5 or 6 takes or more, and they're all good, but there's something about one of the takes that has a little bit of magic, and that's what you were always after in the old days. And recreating that was really exciting, and it made the whole experience really pleasurable. And I think that's come out on the album. And so we're really, really pleased with it, and we're really pleased with the reaction that it's had too.
Some great songs on there. Yeah, talking about the Drop, Reeling and Stupid, a lot of bluesy songs on there, and it sounds like something you would have came out with in the '60s, but it has like a fresh sound. Very cool songs. I've been jamming to them.
Oh, good man.
Really, they're really, I mean, you know, a lot of times you interview people, you say, yeah, that sounds great, and people think, yeah, right. Nah, man. And the harmonies, I love I'm a harmonies kind of a guy. I love harmonies. You've always had a great...
There's one track on, and this is the sort of thing we could do because of the way we're doing it. And because the thing is that when you've got your own studio, you can work on something, and if you feel it's suddenly lost its way, you can just go away for 3 or 4 days, and nothing's touched in the studio. So you can then walk back with a fresh mind,
right,
and pick up where you were. I mean, that is a joy. It really is. There's one track called Rediscover on it that starts off with an a cappella, 8 bars of harmony. And I really wanted to do that because we'd just been involved with a co-starred tour with Brian Wilson. And I don't know if you've seen this band, but he's got a great band behind him, and it's a big band, and they all sing, and they used to warm up every afternoon before their sound check. They used to warm up, and before they went on stage, just out in the hall outside their dressing room, which would only be just up the way from us, from our dressing room, and they would sing either an old song of Brian's or something that they'd been practicing, but they weren't necessarily doing on stage, or a new thing, and they'd all sing. So you go have 8 or 9 people singing a cappella, and I absolutely loved it. And I thought, and the next morning, I had a keyboard in my room, my hotel room, and just apropos of nothing at all, I remember I had written the song "Rediscover," and we had rehearsed it a bit. I'd rehearsed it with Colin anyway, so he was getting to know the song. And I thought, what a great thing it would be to write a little 8-bar a cappella introduction, and then merge into the song, and it was because of that a cappella thing that I heard the other guys doing, and I didn't want to copy anything, but I thought if I could write something that has a little bit of dissonance in it, in the harmony, it wasn't just normal harmonies of thirds and fifths and all that sort of thing, but it had some interesting moves within the harmony that suddenly, after just 8 bars, merged into the song proper. How cool that would be! And we rehearsed the beginning of it. I just gave the guys, I said to Colin, if you could just sing this, and I said to Soren and the bass player, could you just take this one, and I'll take the falsetto thing on the top, and we just tried it with 4 of us, and it was such fun that when we got back home, I brushed it up a little bit, and we recorded it, and that 8 bars was recorded late at night after we'd been recording. We spent 2 hours, and it's one of the few things on the album where we actually double track the harmonies, because I wanted that feeling of fullness. On the other songs, we deliberately tended not to double track the harmonies because we wanted that more raw feeling of single voices singing together. And on Drop Reeling the Stupid, I wanted to do one where I shared the lead vocal with Colin. So on the second section of the verse each time, it's sort of me singing,
Awesome.
So that was great fun too. But it meant that we could just do those things, and we wouldn't double track. We would almost never double track, except on that one song, Rediscover. And then there was a bit in the middle where I'd written some harmonies for the band to sing behind Colin, and I couldn't get it to sound full enough at all. And it happened to be on that day that my brother-in-law that I told you is Paul McCartney's engineer said, you should go back to, you've been going back to an old-fashioned way of recording. He said, you should go back to what you used to do. He said, just all of you sing around one mic. So we did that so all those harmonies in the middle on Rediscover, which sound huge, we suddenly got that sound by all singing around one mic, which of course is what we had to do in the early days. It's what the Beatles always did. And the difference was extraordinary. I didn't want to do it, first of all, because I thought if someone's just slightly out of tune, we won't be able to put it right, etc. He said, listen, don't worry about it. Just go out there and do it and try it. And we did. And we had it down in an hour, and we did double track those harmonies in the middle. Again, because I wanted it to be big. And they were just R's in the middle, but we got it sounding really, really big. And it was those sort of enjoyable moments that made the recording process, feel so fresh and so nice.
It sounds great. I mean, all the songs, you could tell that you really, put a lot of heart and love into it.
Thank you.
You Could Be My Love is a standout song for me.
Thank you.
And I think it's a special thing. It says a lot. There ain't too many bands that have been around for 60-something years and they're still making albums. In fact, there aren't any that really, the Rolling Stones, I think, are coming out with a new album. I'm just saying there aren't any bands that are been around for 60-something years that are man, it's been an honor to talk to you. I didn't mean to keep you, I could talk to you probably all day.
Hello. Oh, yeah.
I appreciate you chatting with me.
Oh, thank you very much, Gary. Thank you very much.
But great album. Like I said, it's one thing to be around for all those years, but to put out a brand new album that actually sounds great, I mean, you accomplished something, and I know you have people all over the world and musicians that say that you are the reason that they still play. But I
Oh man,
appreciate you.
thank you very much.
Well, I hope all the best to you. You got a tour coming up, finishing up
Yeah,
some tours, right? Where are you going to
yeah.
be?
Sorry.
You coming up? What tours have you got coming up? I mean, what
Oh, it's
places?
only. Well, I mean, we've got a month's tour starting in Canada, and then going on to the West Coast, and then working over to different parts of America. I don't have all the dates in front of me at the moment, but that's going to be an intensive month's tour. Um, and we've had a very intense couple of years actually. So after that, it gets a lot. We have a lot more time off, but we've just done the first UK tour. We've just finished that that we've done in years, and it was great. We had great audiences, and I'm pleased to say, and a great response to that. And we've got certainly already we've got a couple of things put into the States for next year, the first quarter of next year, including at least one rock and roll cruise and some southern states playing in Florida and probably New Orleans. I'm not sure exactly where they are, but that's being put in at the moment.
I have to make one of those shows. That's in my area. I need to come out and check it out. But
Great.
but once again, just thank you so much for talking to me. I know everybody's going to love this. I know they're already excited about me talking to you, but thank you so much for talking to me today.
Oh, thanks, Gary. Great pleasure.
You have a good day.
Take care, man.
Thank you. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Be sure to head on over to zombiesmusic.com, the official website of the Zombies. Check out their new album, Different Games. You're going to love it. And always remember to keep the music real.